greenhouse people, I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and in an effort to provide this information in any way you choose to consume it, we are pleased to offer it in video and podcast formats. My guest today is Dr. Nathan Jahnke, the fearless leader of Ball Technical Services and the Culture Research Manager at Ball. Nathan holds a PhD from North Carolina State University and is here to talk about possibly the most important step in production, starting with unrooted cuttings: rehydration. Cuttings can dehydrate at any point in the supply chain, from harvest to stick, and research shows URCs could be dehydrated by as much as 20% when they arrive at your greenhouse and your crew unpacks the boxes. Although offshore farms have greatly improved harvest and handling processes in recent years, some unavoidable dehydration will occur at every step in the process. Remember, as soon as harvest occurs, dehydration begins. Then the storage of cuttings in coolers at the farm increases that dehydration. Shipping certainly reduces hydration, and the longer the cuttings are in boxes, the worse this gets. And finally, the sticking process has a dehydrating effect. Bottom line is that your young plants have been through a lot before they hit the bench and start to grow, but knowing this doesn't reduce your frustration and the fact that wilted cuttings can impact production throughout the entire process and result in losses or shrink. But enough out of me. Nathan is here to help reduce risk at this stage in production, sharing research and applied strategies to help set you and those young plants up for success. If you like this installment, be sure to subscribe to the Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite podcast app and find dozens of Tech on Demand videos and the Ballseed YouTube channel. Nathan, welcome to Tech on Demand. Why don't you go ahead and jump right into what you, your team, and the greenhouses you work with have learned about cutting hydration?
Thanks so much, Bill, for that awesome introduction. You hit so many key points that I'm going to talk about today. And this is really, truly the culmination of a lot of research that we've done here at Ball. My predecessor, Will Healy, growers that we've worked with, interns that have done research. So really, we're bringing it all together, all these resources that we have on Grower Talks and different platforms to really help growers out there achieve uniform rooting of cuttings. So to get started here, like you said, Bill, it's from the stock plant all the way to when the cutting arrives and is on the bench. And I don't know about many of you, but I've got young kids, and I've been on road trips myself as a young kid as well. And it takes a long time, and you often get the question, are we there yet? And I feel like that's probably what our cuttings are feeling like sometimes too. They're growing in an awesome environment, probably Central America, beautiful light, hydration, lots of nutrition, and then get harvested, and it just takes a while before they get to their final destination. And as you said, Bill, dehydration can occur at any of these stages and most likely occurs. And we just have this problem that plants lose water. So we're going to talk about this hydration highway from stalk all the way to sticking, where cuttings lose water, why they lose water, and then we're going to end with some strategies that you can use to mitigate this dehydration and actually improve the hydration of your cuttings, which does have some really positive benefits on the bench when producing liners. So the challenges with dehydrated cuttings, first off, is non-uniform rooting. And why this is so important is because when you have non-uniformity, it's going to affect every tray, right? In the greenhouse, a unit of measure is the tray. If there's 10% affected, it's not like 100 trays, just 10 trays are going to be bad. No, it's every tray is going to have some plant that is affected and not performing the way you want it to, which means you have to search every tray, pull the ones that aren't up to snuff out. And so it really creates this downstream labor effect if we don't start with uniformity. Dehydrated cuttings also can cause some sticking efficiency reduction. So if you're sticking cuttings and they're floppy, right, it's going to take you more time to get them into the tray. Just like the non-uniformity, we get losses and shrink. So if you get 100 cuttings in and then you only can ship out 90 of them, then we have a shrink of 10 cuttings. And we want every cutting to be successful that comes through our door. And then if you do have dehydration, there's potential to have a longer crop time. And we want to turn our greenhouses quick, right? So Any delay in this is going to be a problem, and that's what this picture on the right-hand side is showing us. The top, those two lines of rows of cuttings have been rehydrated, and you can see that every single one of them has roots on it. And the bottom two rows, you see where I've circled, certain cuttings have no roots, some have shorter roots, some have long roots, and this is that non-uniform rooting that we're talking about when we don't rehydrate cuttings. Just a couple videos here to demonstrate this lack of sticking efficiency. On the left-hand side, I'm sticking dehydrated cuttings of lavender, and you can see I'm using loose fill, so this is a very soft, pliable mix here, but these cuttings are just flimsy and not going to substrate very easily. So this is going to slow down sticking. You might have to dibble, and it's just frustrating for your sticking crews, which causes you to lose time and money. On the right-hand side here, these are rehydrated cuttings. So already you can see that the sticking process is much faster. It's going to the tray a lot easier. And you might not have to dibble this, right? And dibbling is a very common practice, but it has the opportunity to leave air gaps next to the stem base of the cutting, which means you're not going to get a good shoot to substrate contact, and that could inhibit or delay rooting. So these rehydrated cuttings are going to root more uniformly, and it's going to be a more efficient process for your sticking crews. But let's talk about what wilting actually is and why that happens. I got to jump onto this side a little bit because of my science background. And wilting actually is a symptom of low turgor pressure. So it's the pressure inside cells that actually keeps plants upright. And you can see I've demonstrated this at the bottom of the slide here. We have this sort of characterization of a plant cell, and that blue blob there is the vacuole where a lot of the water is contained. And what this actually does is causes pressure on the outside of the cell membrane and keeps it the shape that it should be. So when plants lose that water, we see the vacuole shrink, and now the cell membrane isn't nice and plump, and that's why the plants themselves are floppy or laying over, right? So water is important for plants just like it is for people. You can see your hands wrinkle up, you can feel your lips get chapped when you're dehydrated. So water is really important for stability of the plant. It's important for cell elongation expansion. I worked on peonies for my PhD, and water is one of the main ways that a peony bud goes from a golf ball into this fluffy balloon of a flower that everybody loves, right? So it's also important for moving nutrients and, of course, photosynthesis. So we have to have water, but it's also important to mitigate this wilting dehydration. Water moves through plants for a few different reasons, and one of the main ways that we lose water is evapotranspiration. Transpiration is the movement of water from the roots out the stomates, and you can see that in the top right part of our slide here. Stomates are usually in the leaves, and this is where gas exchange happens. So CO2 is coming in, oxygen's going out, but we're also losing water vapor. So that helps the plant create this continuous column of water throughout itself, keeping it upright and growing, right? Stomates do close at night, and so this movement basically stops or slows down, but we still get some evaporation from plants themselves, which is why cuticles are important. Sometimes you see plants with a waxy layer, and that actually helps prevent dehydration. But this is important because even cuttings, they all have stomates, right? At nighttime, they're going to close those stomates, but they can have water evaporating from their surfaces. They're not quite as toned as some other plants growing in super high light environments, right? So they are going to lose some water just naturally. Respiration is also a very important component, and you'll often see ice packs in boxes of cuttings. You'll hear about coolers that cuttings are being stored into. And the reason this is important is because of respiration. Respiration is that process that plants use, as well as we use, to create energy that we can use, but it also produces heat as well as water. So it's putting out water from respiration, so we're losing water there. Heat increases the temperature, which can cause a more increase of water loss as well. And then we have the environmental factors that affect water loss. So humidity or relative humidity, vapor pressure deficit, which we have some content on Tech on Demand that you can look into, as well as the plant and air temperature themselves. We have to think about that plant temperature. And in this graph here, I just am illustrating a little bit of how respiration changes with temperature and why it's so important that farms have a cooling process to remove field heat. Respiration is very low at low temperatures, and it starts to increase as the temperature increases. So this is why we want to have our cuttings cold and maintain a good cold chain. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But if you ever see that picture on the bottom where you see condensation in the bag, that means those plants are respiring, they're losing water and it's condensating in the bag, and the water came from our cuttings. So that means they're dehydrated. So let's go through all the process from when cuttings are harvested all the way to when they're stuck, and talk about where they're losing water. Our water loss potential comes from the management of the water, so how the farm is watering those plants, how they're mitigating water loss through the harvest and post-harvest handling processes, but also the time it takes for that cutting to get back into a humid environment and have roots, so it's taking up water itself, and then also with the handling. And that handling is at every step of the URC hydration chain. And we've done some research to quantify what's the status of cuttings when they arrive. And anywhere from 0 to 60% water loss when cuttings are arriving on the bench. On average, this is about 20% of the water content of cuttings is missing when you're sticking them. So it's pretty evident that we are not sticking fully hydrated cuttings. And so we're going to talk about why that happens through this process, and then we'll end up with how to alleviate it. Starting off with stock plant hydration. So as you know, watering in the greenhouse, there is variability in the substrate, its water holding capacity, the containers we use, the irrigation system, the plants change in their water needs over time, as well as their root development. And that's no exception on our farms. They have their own environments to handle. They grow in very different media sometimes and different containers, and they have people watering as well. So this is something that they are working on, managing their irrigation schedules, and things happen, like it gets rainy and plants don't use as much water, or high light and there's really high temperatures. So this is why there can be some stock plant variability and the hydration of those stock plants and affecting the hydration of those cuttings as they're coming off. But I've been to many of those farms. They have great teams in place. They're working diligently to learn more about hydration, when they should water, when they should not water. So this is something they're working on, just like we're working on our end here once the cuttings get to us. Harvest timing, as we talked about, also has a big impact on the hydration status. Usually cuttings are more hydrated in the mornings. If you think about, water is still moving into the plants at least a little bit overnight. And so plants actually have the highest water potential in the morning, right before the sun hits those plants, and that's when they really elongate. But as we move towards the afternoon, plants are evaporating water, right? They're transpiring water, and so they're losing it, but they're also producing more carbohydrates. And so these two factors we can see in the cutting quality and the resulting liners that they produce. On the top of this picture, the 3 rows, those cuttings of Buddleia were harvested in the morning, and in the afternoon, the bottom 3 rows. So you can see much better uniformity of cuttings that were harvested in the afternoon. And this is really generous specific. Some cuttings or species like to be harvested in the afternoon because they need more carbohydrates, and some need that water potential. It also has to do with the amount of light that those plants have received in the day prior. But also the irrigation and the hours since their last irrigation, right? If we irrigated 4 hours before cutting harvest, the hydration status of those cuttings can be very different if they were watered 30 minutes before the cutting harvest. Moving into post-harvest handling. So after the cuttings have been harvested, it's a lot about time and time to get the temperature down. So First off, with time to get to the cooler, obviously we're harvesting in a greenhouse situation where the temperatures are relatively high. Humidity could be variable. And what a lot of farms will do is they'll harvest the cuttings and put them in a styrofoam box or a different container, and oftentimes that container has ice packs in it. And when we think about ice packs, they often don't decrease the temperature of the things next to them very quickly, but they at least maintain the temperature from going a lot higher. We really need to get them into a cooler to remove that field heat. In the center of this slide here, you see the rainbowy picture. This is actually a picture with an infrared camera. And what you can see here is that inside this box where the cuttings are stored, that's the lowest temperature. And then that green blob in the center is the cuttings. So you can see the chamber itself is cold, but there's still some field heat on those cuttings, and we have to get them to the cooler in order to remove it. The way this is removed is through forced air and moving a cold air across the cuttings to remove the heat. And you can see some blowers up there on the top that the cuttings are being pushed through. This is super common with post-harvest handling of cut flowers. They've got this down to a science. They have boxes with certain air holes and sizes that then the air moves through to remove that field heat. And some cutting farms are implementing that technology as well. On the right-hand side there, you can see some cuttings in boxes, in storage. And of course, the duration of the storage can vary depending on the crop. Some can handle it a lot longer than others, but obviously the fresher the cutting, the sooner it gets to the bench, usually the better. Looking at shipping and the amount of time it takes to get to the greenhouse bench, the cold chain is super important. The graph on the bottom here is a temperature log of some cuttings that were shipped from the farm and then ended up on the greenhouse bench. And what you'll see here is this line right around 15 degrees Celsius, and that's really where we want to keep the temperature down. In some cases, that temperature goes up. And usually temperature increases are not a good thing, but really the most detrimental part of temperature swings are the bounces up and down, because that really changes the respiration of the cuttings and causes condensation in the bag. So we could get diseases, botrytis, or a breakdown of those cuttings. And that we see here on a few instances when we're in red, go down to green, back into red, back into green, back into red. Those are the bounces that we really want to avoid. And so removing the field heat is going to help ensure the cuttings are more likely stay in that green zone, in addition to the ice packs that are there. And again, those ice packs are just maintaining temperature. Unless the cuttings are touching them, then you could potentially get a cooling effect. And again, of course, the duration that this shipping process takes is really important. Usually cuttings can get in pretty quickly, but if you're using something like a mail carrier, FedEx, or UPS, sometimes those can take different amount of times, and they usually can't maintain cold chains. And that's why a lot of breeding companies or even farms are using a trucking operation where they can maintain the cold chain from the farm to a certain location and keep the cuttings at an appropriate temperature so that they arrive more fresh on your bench. I just wanted to illustrate this a little bit and give an insight to how farms are working on this from their end. We looked at Achillea New Vintage Red, and you'll often see in the bags of cuttings there's some paper in there. Sometimes there's not paper, sometimes it's wet, sometimes it's dry. And we were looking at the breakdown of Achillea and how the different paper and moisture content affects that. And we've got dry paper, no paper, 50% wet, fully wet, and then cuttings that were rehydrated prior to shipping. You can really see that there's a impact on how you handle those cuttings and pack them when they arrive. Basically, dry paper did not work. Fully wet did not work. But the no paper and then rehydrated worked really well. So this is really crop dependent. And there's also a lot of pre-harvest factors that go into it. But just wanted to give you guys some insight that the farms do a lot of research and work on how they handle their cuttings in order to achieve a successful crop coming out on your bench. Lastly, when it gets to the grower, We have arrival, we need to inspect those cuttings, and then there's the staging prior to sticking. The ice pack at this point could be in a very different status from when it arrived. Sometimes ice packs are melted, and while that is something that could be very scary, the more important thing is what is the temperature of your cuttings. So if you see a melted ice pack, hopefully you have a way to measure the temperature of your cuttings. And I'm using an infrared temperature gun right here in the top right. And what I'm looking for is a temperature of the stem base. And we really want that to be as low as possible, generally below 55. If you're below 60, generally that's really good too. But if your cuttings are somewhere 70 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, then we would get concerned that they've been at that temperature for an inappropriate time. They could have some resulting breakdown or yellowing or leaf abscission. So really focus on the temperature of your cuttings more than the temperature of your ice packs. Because remember, those just maintain the temperature. And if they melted, they were releasing cold into, or removing heat from the box, I should say. At the time of inspection, the location environment is very important. Did your cuttings stay on a loading dock? Are they sitting in the UPS truck? Are they sitting in your office? All of those have very different temperatures and humidities. The best thing you can do is get them into a cooler as fast as possible and unpack those boxes, remove any heat that has built up in those boxes, and get them cold again. And obviously, the time to handle unpacking, staging for sticking is going to impact your cuttings. We want to do that as quickly as possible. And I did want to touch on also of why coolers are important, not only just for the temperature and removal of heat, but coolers also dehumidify because of how they work. If you look at this diagram here, we can see hot air on the right-hand side and a condenser. What does a condenser do? Well, it condenses water. And so then we're pushing that air through this expansion valve into an evaporator. So that evaporator is removing water from the system to cool or remove heat and provide cool air. So if you're keeping your cuttings in a cooler without additional humidity, you're going to be losing water because that's how the cooling process works. So that's where we're going to get into some of these strategies here and why time in a cooler, while temperature is good, the humidity could have a detrimental effect on your cuttings. Lastly, the sticking process. There are a lot of different places where everyone sticks cuttings, right? And this could vary in the temperature, the humidity, depending on the season and the time of year. But this can be an important time of dehydration for your cuttings, especially with how long it takes you to stick those cuttings. In this top picture here, you can see a pretty standard sticking environment. We've got our shelves, we've got trays of stuck cuttings, and we've got people sticking cuttings. Well, if this sticking area is at, say, 75 degrees or 80 degrees, and if we think about regular humidity, it could be anywhere from like 0, 10%, say we're in a dry Colorado environment, up to 80% humidity in the summer in North Carolina. Well, obviously the drier one's going to dehydrate those cuttings, and the longer the crew takes to stick those cuttings, the longer they sit on the shelves in those trays, they're losing water. So compared to the picture on the right-hand side, we see the shelves, we see trays of cuttings, but there's fog everywhere. Obviously, that environment on the right-hand side is going to limit more loss of water than the one on the left. And lastly, we think of the bench and the greenhouse environment. If we water over those cuttings, great, we're providing a film of water, which will help prevent some dehydration. But if, depending on your mist schedule, how frequently your mist goes on, when the tray got onto the bench, if, say, it mists and you put the tray on and then it doesn't mist for another 5 minutes, well, those cuttings may or may not have any water on them, and they're going to lose water at that point. So there's a lot of variables here, and we just want to avoid dehydration and stick hydrated cuttings. A few examples here of how that impacts the rooting quality. So these are geranium cuttings, and they were, this is 7 days after sticking. All the way on the left-hand side, 6 hours of dry time, then 4, then 2, and all the way on the right, this was a direct stick. So from left to right, you can see decreasing amounts of water loss, and then the results in the roots there on the bottom. So something that didn't lose any water obviously roots better than something that's lost 16% of its water, which is only about 85% of its water capacity. And what this looks like graphically then is basically a fresh cutting has the highest potential in weight, but also the highest potential in its rooting, or what we're calling a root rating here on the left-hand side. And then as you increase in dry time, that rooting potential just goes down, 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 and down. So that's what we want to avoid here. In that rooting area, we talked about this a little bit already. Obviously, the air and root zone temperatures are important factors to dehydration, whether we're heating or not. In the winter months, obviously, we're dehumidifying the area by using heaters. Our mist is going to change that hydration potential, whether you have a heavy mist nozzle with large water droplets, a fog nozzle, whether you're using time-based or environmental-based misting. But then also the substrate moisture content. If you see that picture on the bottom there, that is a pre-made plug of media, and I pulled out this cutting, and the substrate is completely dry in the core. So if you don't have your substrate appropriately moistened, you don't want to be saturated, but if it doesn't have the right moisture content, it's pulling water away from that stem base, which is going to slow rooting. And here again, we can see some examples of cuttings that have been stuck 1 hour of dry time overnight, which is not uncommon, 3 hours of dry time, and then saturated after sticking. And the saturated one has the most roots, where the cutting that was left out overnight has the least amount of roots. So again, rehydrated cuttings are going to root faster and more uniformly. All right, so now we're to the core of the presentation, talking about rehydration and what we can do to alleviate all of those challenges and potential risks of sticking dehydrated cuttings. And we talked a little bit about on the farm and what they're doing, right? They're managing their irrigation to hopefully provide hydrated cuttings coming off the stalk. They're also working on different methods to mitigate dehydration prior to shipping. And then we have after arrival, the staging, sticking, and on the bench processes. And that's where we're focusing for the next few minutes. There are really three main ways to rehydrate cuttings. First off is with mist. Second is dipping. And third is fog. Then why would we do one or the other is dependent on a lot of different things, and that's what we're going to go through. But in general, misting, that's really easy. We're doing that anyways, right? We're misting the cuttings to keep them hydrated until they produce roots. So there's really no delay in getting the cuttings on the bench if you're using this method. Dipping, there's a lot of opportunities for additives in this dip solution. So certain phytohormones like IBA, pesticides, surfactants, those sorts of things we're going to talk about. And then there really is no addition of water weight to your trays. So if you have your moisture level dialed in at the time of sticking, and then you dip, there's no added water, where if we get extra water from misting, that can delay rooting. Fog is the one that I have a little bit of a preference towards because I think it provides an efficient use of time with staging and planning if you have that built into your operations. And there's really minimal labor to implement this type of strategy if you have the facilities to do it. So let's jump into each one of these. And what we've done for you here is really provide a hierarchy of methods and why we're putting these methods in this type of good, better, best strategy. First off, with our good method is misting. So we don't really have any packaging, right, because the cuttings are already stuck, and it's really done on post-sticking of the bench. Now, there are some risks. We could oversaturate our media, and then you really don't have any control over your environment. It could be a hot day. It could be a cold day. You could be losing a lot of humidity out the greenhouse. So there's a lot of things that could go wrong, but you can rehydrate cuttings by misting, and it's fairly easy to implement. The better strategy is dipping. Dipping doesn't require you to have cuttings in the bag, but you can also dip them in the bag if you want to. You don't have to mess with individual cuttings at that point. And this is all done prior to sticking. So it does require a little bit of labor, but there's a huge potential to add different components into that dip solution. So here's some research done by Dr. John Dole, and I think Dr. Jim Faust has had some input into this as well. Just grabbed a few of those slides from the American Floral Endowment, where they looked at poinsettia as well as New Guinean patients. And you can see there they've got untreated, water control, and the C is capsule, K is KIBA, which is a rooting hormone, F is fructose, and then they've got a bunch of other combinations with things like pageant here to try and determine, well, does dipping in these solutions provide more roots and longer roots? And really what they saw through this research is capsule, or the surfactant, has the biggest impact on the root number, whereas root length isn't quite as easy to quantify the impact of that. But again, capsule has been shown to have the biggest impact, as well as rooting hormones. There's KIBA soluble salts out there, as well as Advocate, which is a IBA, liquid IBA that can be applied. Those have huge potential to be used. There's been some work done on carbohydrates, adding sugars into your media like glucose, fructose, or sucrose. That one we're actually going to do some more research on here at fall, and hopefully have some updates on for you. Pesticides can be a challenging area because it does need to be labeled for this process, and there's not a lot of things, at least in the US, labeled for this. In the Canadian market, there are a few more things labeled for the dipping process, but think of those as potential opportunities to mitigate future pests while also rehydrating the cuttings. And you could potentially do this with oils or other biologicals. And again, these aren't recommendations. You need to test your own small batches and, of course, read the label to make sure that you can use this for dipping. Okay, so the last strategy that we're talking about is the best. And I put a question mark on that because there are a lot of factors on why you would use one of these methods over the other. But I think fog, again, has the highest potential for reducing labor in operations. So fog can be done without the bag or out of the bag. And we're going to talk about why you need to have them out of the bag, or at least the bag open. And you could do this pre-sticking or before you get to the bench, like we saw in some of those pictures earlier, where the cuttings have been stuck and then they're put in a fog area. But really, we're going to focus on this pre-sticking application of fogging to rehydrate. So I tracked some of this water loss throughout the supply chain. And on this graph, we have weight change on the left-hand side, and then we're going to look at the location of the cuttings and where they came from on the bottom x-axis. Then we've got cuttings that were dipped or fogged, obviously after they were shipped to us. And the bars show how much water we are losing or gaining, and then the bar or the line is showing the cumulative effect of those negative or gains of water. So on the farm, after harvest, we're losing approximately 5% of our water in this situation. Once we get into shipping, we could potentially still lose some water, but hopefully we're maintaining that. Once we get to arrival, in the greenhouse where we could potentially stick these or we're staging, we see that if we dip the cuttings, there's a huge increase in potential water that's either in or on our cuttings. And that's an important takeaway for this graph. There's a lot of free water on the outside of cuttings when you dip them. So if you don't control for that factor, the water is not necessarily in the cutting, but it's at least on the cutting. And after 24 hours, you can see this sort of circle right here. We really didn't gain any hydration of our cuttings, and that's because at this stage, the cuttings are in bags. So really the humidity from the fog isn't able to get into the bag and hydrate those cuttings. Even after 48 hours, there was minimal uptake of water when those cuttings are in bags. Take it a little bit further. We removed all the cuttings from the bags, put them in the fog chamber, and after 65 hours total from when they arrived at the greenhouse, we increased the amount of water by over 15%. So really, this shows you that the bag itself or the box, if you don't remove those cuttings from the boxes and open up those bags and you've got fog, you're basically doing nothing. So we need to provide access to that water vapor getting in and around those cuttings. This also shows you that within 17 hours of opening that bag, we're hydrating those cuttings. So you can hydrate pretty quickly if you're using fog and you're doing it properly. Here's a great pictorial. We've got this in one of our Tech on Demand resources. I think it's the Poinsettia Action Guide, and it shows you that, again, that visual impact of storing cuttings in a cooler versus a humid cooler, and then in a bag or without a bag. So obviously, we have our bag here within the blue. Some of these cuttings show a little bit sign of wilting. They're not parallel to the ground anymore. They're falling flat. Then we move to the humid chamber without one, and those cuttings are very well hydrated. And this last picture on the right-hand side is really showing you that dehydrating effect of coolers and how they're removing water from the system, that it's removing water from the cuttings. All right, again, just another example here. So we have cuttings that were stored in bags in fog, bags that were dipped, and then bags that were just left without any hydration strategy at all on the right-hand side. Once all of those cuttings were removed from the bags and put in a fog environment, boom, you see them sort of fluff up and take up more space within that wayboat there. So that's what we're seeing within 17 hours. All those cuttings are rehydrated, and because they have access to that water vapor. Okay, so again, here are all the strategies, the ranking that we put to them on which one we think is good, better, and best. But a lot of this depends on what works for your operation, the flow of people, where you have cuttings, where you're sticking. It really depends on what's going to work for you, and I want to stress on that. So, because not everyone has a cooler that they can put in a micro cool fog system or high pressure fog system, right? So I just want to go through a few questions here of what factors should you consider when thinking about which method to implement. First off is labor. Are you hand sticking or using a mechanical sticking device, right? Hand sticking, you've got a lot more labor involved, movement of cuttings, but you have more opportunity to place them in certain environments. Like you see here in this picture, they're stacked out nicely, put in the cooler, and then this cooler has fog. But you'll also see that these bags are not open to that water vapor. The staging process, do you have a large cooler or do you only have a head house? Can you put in a fog nozzle in your cooler, or maybe you can put it in the head house after the trays have been stuck, and you can leave them in that fog environment before you put them in the greenhouse. Something like an ISO machine, if you got that right, it's a little bit more challenging to keep those cuttings hydrated while they're moving along this belt, and you don't necessarily want to add a lot of water vapor around expensive electrical equipment. So keep that in mind. Do you have a location for fogging? Do you have infrastructure and equipment? You can get some relatively inexpensive fogging nozzles to implement this on. Even a cooler, like we're going to see here in a little bit, we've just used a humidifier to produce that fog. But also think of the flow of your cuttings. At what time points do you have time where cuttings are just sitting and waiting? And is that appropriate time and place to put in humidity so that those cuttings can at least not dehydrate, but maybe they could also hydrate as well? What do even dehydrated cuttings look like? We saw some of it before, but we've got a great Tech on Demand document that shows these pictures as well as the strategies. Um, Teach your sticking crew, if they've got dehydrated cuttings, show them what it looks like. If the stem's bending when they're putting it on the substrate, you're probably not fully hydrated. If the cutting's not flying like a bird and parallel with the ground, if it's sagging down, it's dehydrated. If you have necrotic tips on your cuttings, all of those are signs that the cutting has been dehydrated or is not as hydrated as it should be. How do you know cuttings are rehydrated or hydrated themselves? Look for the fluff. We saw that before. This top picture here shows cuttings upon arrival on the left-hand side. and then after they've been rehydrated, you can see them just expand more and take up more space. They should be turgid. They shouldn't be any wilting or flopping around. And this sort of time to do this can be variable depending on the method and your environment. Misting, obviously, there's a lot of factors with what your sticking bench looks like and what is the greenhouse environment. But ideally, your cuttings should be upright and hydrated from your mist system within 48 hours. If they're not, you're either not providing enough mist or there's a lot of light or a lot of heat that's pulling water out of those cuttings. The dip process could look very different for a lot of different people. This could be a quick dip, 1 minute, all the way to a 30-minute dip. But you should see visible hydration probably within 12 to 24 hours from that dip solution, as long as after you stick it and it gets on the bench, your environment's not pulling more water out of your cuttings. Fog, again, that could be super variable depending on how you're doing it. But I would suggest fogging at least overnight. You've got the bag open or the cuttings are removed up to 24 hours. And then you should have hydrated cuttings at sticking. And at least in my research in the greenhouse I'm working here in West Chicago, we've sort of taken this approach that, cuttings come in, we really don't get them until like 10:30, between 10:30 and noon. Why take all that time to try and stick them in the afternoon when it's hot, everyone's tired, and you're potentially leaving because you got there at 5 or 6 a.m.? Stick those cuttings in the cooler, in the fog chamber, and stick them tomorrow morning when everyone's fresh and getting in right away in the day. So that's where you're thinking about the time that you have, the space that you have, and implementing the right strategy in the right place. Okay, I did want to provide some examples of like how are we doing this. This is our fog chamber that we developed. It's a small one, just in a cooler that we're holding at 50 degrees. All we needed is some PVC, some poly or plastic to make the walls, and a humidifier. So you can buy humidifiers off of Amazon or any box store, right? Make sure you've got one that's got a large enough water tank so that you're not having to replace it every day. You want it to at least last you a couple days. Or you can actually plumb in a system that's delivering humidity. But this is super easy to implement on a smaller scale. And what's important here with fog is that it has a very small water droplet size. You can see that sort of in the image up on top. That small water droplet size is hanging in the air for a very long time compared to traditional mist systems on a greenhouse bench, right? You see that mist, it comes out and then it falls very quickly. We want the water vapor to stay in the air for a long amount of time. For larger operations, you obviously might go with something that's a little bit more built in and plumbed in into a cooler or your sticking facility. So a microcool fog system or a dry fogging system is going to be what you're going to implement and apply over a large area. And the importance is you want to be able to see some water vapor when you're walking in. If there's just water on the floor, that's probably not enough humidity to get your cuttings rehydrated. Are there more resources for dipping? This is a hot topic. It's a very popular way of treating cuttings when it comes into the greenhouse, and there are a lot of resources. So I didn't spend a ton of time on this because it goes way outside of the realm of rehydration. But Grower Talks has a great article. There's lots of eGrow resources and videos to how to do dipping. And you might be concerned of what about the potential disease concern. They've actually done some research on this, and yeah, there's a potential to spread some diseases around. But when I've talked to people, there's a lot of large growers implementing this. There really hasn't been that much of a concern from dipping cuttings and disease. But you need to do your own tests and weigh the risks of what you're going and what strategy you're going to implement for rehydrating cuttings. Some other resources for you for Tech on Demand. I've got one here on the best management practice for URC hydration and a bunch of other links, the presentation from John. And I hope you find this information helpful. Of course, all of us here on the tech team at Ballseed are happy to help you figure out how to implement this in your operation. And I thank you for your time.
Nathan, thank you for your time and going through all of those details and the good, better, best approaches to rehydrating cuttings. Thanks also for sharing those resources. I will put the links to all of those in the show notes of the podcast and the video description, so that all of you listeners and viewers can click those links and check it out for a little bit more of a deeper dive. But Nathan, thank you for covering so much in a good short period of time. And you can find dozens, if not hundreds, of Tech on Demand educational resources online, as you see on this slide. Every week, I send a newsletter covering a range of cultural and technical topics. We've created tons of videos for greenhouse professionals of all skill levels. The podcast is a great way to learn about technical topics on the go. And if you want to connect with a huge global network of now more than 6,000 of your peers, I suggest you join the Greenhouse Tech Team on Facebook. Just search Greenhouse Tech Team, answer a couple simple questions, and I will let you right in. Once again, Nathan, thanks for your time. And I'm sure we're going to talk again soon, because we all know the research team at Ball does not sit still, and you guys are always quick to share what you learn. I'm Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand, and on behalf of our entire team, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and take care out there.